Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here at the Knowledge and Learning Commons, or the Commons as we call it. A short video was just played showing the doors of the library opening. So welcome. My name is Natalie Alexander. I work at the UN Library and Archives in Geneva for the Commons. I have dark brown hair, light skin. I'm wearing a black dress, and my background today is white with the logo of the Commons. Closed captions are available for you today, and to enable those, you can go to the bottom right of your screen and select the CC button, which is the captions/subtitles button, and click to enable them. And these captions are automatically generated via Microsoft. Today's platform is Microsoft Teams live events, and so to be able to interact with you, there is a Q&A section to the right of your screen. And so there you can ask for assistance from us and to also ask questions throughout the session. If you're new to the Commons, this is our space for being able to share knowledge informally across our different areas in the UN. And our sessions are really about being able to share knowledge about the way we work, professional development, and multilateralism. And we are here to serve diplomats, UN staff, and interns across UN Geneva. But now that we're live, we're also here to connect with you around the world. Today's session is part of our Build Back Better series, which we began to look at what we've learned over the past year through the pandemic, especially now that we're working much more online, take that and move forward building on these experiences. And today's session is really essential to this Build Back Better discussion. Our session today is called Advancing Accessibility in Our Digital Work. And the importance of accessibility has just been highlighted even more by the fact that we're working more and more online through this pandemic. And this acceleration is here to stay in terms of working online. So what does this mean in terms of supporting accessibility in our digital work? Our speakers today, who I'll introduce to you soon, will take us through these key learning objectives. Learning why digital accessibility is essential to our evolving work online. Exploring key ways to make our work more accessible, including events, meetings, communication, and documents and multimedia. We'll learn more about the Disability Inclusion Team at UN Geneva and the UN Geneva Disability Inclusion Strategy, the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, and also find further resources and links to be able to start integrating accessibility and digital inclusion in our teams. We only have an hour though, so our speakers are really going to be focusing on some key tips to immediately start to apply in our daily work. I'm very happy to introduce our speakers to you now. We have a guest speaker with us today. Her name is Carolyn P. Phillips. She's Tools for Life and the National Pass It On Center at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She'll be sharing mainly on online events and meetings and also presenting and moderating online. Our other speakers are representing the Disability Inclusion Team at UN Geneva. Firstly, Kira Kruglikova is the Director of the Division of Conference Management, or DCM, and she'll be sharing more about the Inclusion Team as well as the Inclusion Strategy. She'll also introduce a bit later a video on sign language. We have also with us Mark Murphy, the Chief of the Design and Production section at DCM, who'll share more about multimedia, including alternate text, and also Juan Carlos Corral from the Spanish Desktop Publishing Unit in DCM, who'll be sharing more about documentation, including Microsoft Word. Also with us behind the scenes is Rebecca Edgington, an interpreter and the focal point for international sign at DCM. And she'll join us a bit later on to answer any questions you might have about sign language, captioning, and more. Today's session is in English, but you're welcome to ask our speakers questions in English or French, and we'll be able to help translate them if needed. This you can submit in the Q&A section to the right of your screen. But of course, we're all learning about this subject together. So if you have feedback and ideas for us, please also submit that in the Q&A section. We're very open and we want to be positive and learn collectively on this subject. So let's get started. We begin with Kira. Over to you.
Great, thanks so much for that introduction, Natalie. Much appreciated. I'm Kira Krublikova. I am the focal point for disability inclusion at the UN office in Geneva, which we call UNOG. I'm also the chair of the UNOG Disability Inclusion Team, and as Natalie mentioned, I'm the new director of UNOG's Division of Conference Management. I am a light-skinned woman wearing a dark blazer and a bright red scarf. My background is white with the logo of the UNOG Disability Inclusion Team with the words "Think Accessible, Act Inclusive." I'm also a person living with disability. I have ADHD and I take full advantage of some of the tools available in Microsoft Outlook to keep me on schedule and better organized. Like many people of my age, my hearing and vision are no longer as sharp as they were, and I appreciate features that are of use to people with low vision and reduced hearing. So this slide's about the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. This was started, there's a lot of work that went into it behind it, but it was launched on June 11th in 2019. And it's the UN's plan for including people with disabilities in everything we do. It includes an accountability framework, and what that means is that we have to do annual reporting. We have to say, okay, we have done this. What did we plan to do? Did we meet our plans? Did we exceed our plans? Where are we? So that's a structure that requires us to stay focused throughout the year, and that's very helpful. It's also typical of a lot of the other frameworks. They have this for the gender policies as well. The disability inclusion strategy, 4 key areas of responsibility. Leadership, this is about making sure that our leaders convey their support and act on that support. Strategic planning management. Inclusiveness, this is very important, with the idea of nothing about us without us. And accessibility. Programming is less relevant for us at UNOG because we don't have a substantive mandate. We're very much a technical secretariat. And then organizational culture. Next slide, please. So as part of implementing the disability inclusion strategy at UNOG, there is a specific group, which I mentioned was the UNOG Disability Inclusion Team. We renamed after the launch of the Disability Inclusion Strategy. Previously, we were known as the UNOG Accessibility Action Team. So the idea is that we have wide representation, people from across UNOG who work with us. We have people from the Division of Conference Management, Division of Administration, Information Service, the Office of the Director General, Library, which is where Natalie and her team are from, Security, the Medical Service, the Strategic Heritage Plan, which is the large construction work that's being done to renovate the Palais and create a new building, and we have an expert from the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. So we have, one of the things we've done, and I'm really proud of this, and so much great work has been done by the team, is put together a toolkit that has a lot of useful information, and we'll provide more information about the end of that. So the idea is that every one of us can help make our work accessible. This isn't something for somebody else, but a lot of us don't have that expertise. So this is what the toolkit is to do, is to help people say, yeah, I can do this. What actions can I take? Can I make my work accessible? And we'll get into that more. We have an annual action plan. One of the things that's on that is in organizing for events like this one. And if you're interested, if you want to ask more questions or maybe participate more in the group, it's available on UNOG's intranet. You can also send us an email to unogdisabilityinclusion@un.org. That's it for me. Thank you, Natalie. Back to Natalie, please.
Thank you very much, Kira. Over to our next speaker, Carolyn P. Phillips. Thank you, Carolyn.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Natalie and Kira. I am, just so you know who I am and where I am a light-haired woman, light-skinned woman. I have a black sweater on and I have a white background. And I am from Georgia Tech, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be a part of this event today. I brag about y'all all the time at the UN and this team in particular, and how much good work y'all are doing. I'm going to be talking with you really adding on to your Build Back Better, hashtag Build Back Better initiative here. And that vision and that goal is so powerful about how to organize online accessible and inclusive events and meetings. And we'll move to the next slide. I'm going to be breaking this down into a couple of different areas, very specific areas. And this PowerPoint is full of great resources along with my colleagues who are also presenting. And so know know that you'll have access to all this, and tried to piece it into presenting and speaking and moderating. So you'll see some crossover there in some of the tips, but just wanted to make it easy and digestible for you. So we'll move to the next slide. The piece that I did want to let you know is that I am from Georgia and Georgia Tech. If you were ever in Atlanta or ever want to come my way, let me know. I always welcome folks, our partners from around the world. We are a very unique center, the Center for Inclusive Design and Innovation. Accessibility and inclusion is all we do. That's been our mission for years. I've been in this field for 30 years. And that really is our commitment. We are probably one of the few groups that have really celebrated the significant changes that have happened, unfortunately, as a result of COVID-19, but fortunately, a lot more inclusion has happened, and I'll speak to that as we move through. And we really have been positioned for this moment, much like the UN. You know, Kira, as you were saying, you know, you were planning for this 2 years in advance, you know, getting ready in a lot of ways for inclusion and accessibility. And I will say this is also not just professional for me, this is absolutely personal, much like Kira, and thank you for disclosing your own disabilities. I have learning disabilities that absolutely affect the way that I navigate my life professionally and personally. I have learning disabilities, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and auditory processing. And so I'm very dependent upon captioning and all of those things and accessibility features. And we'll move to the next slide. So we are always online. There's an image over here of Zoom with a bunch of dogs. This is something that actually my team, we do this quite often, where we put our cats or dogs or what have you online. But we all have these personas, and we all, you know, have these very different ways that we're presenting ourselves. But we just, you know, I think that just knowing that we're online, we're getting to know even more about each other in a lot of ways, rather than that person that we bring to a professional event. So the online is different. You know, my team, we have been actively providing, you know, in some ways really seized the moment to provide those virtual tours, virtual exhibit halls. When I was on site in Geneva at the in the library, which, wow, your building is incredible. Your, you know, the whole structure, the whole, I love everything about your campus. And but the library in particular, I was like, oh, people from around the world would benefit from being here. And there's so much that y'all can do and are doing when it comes to that virtual format and offering those virtual tours. So we've been doing that, conferences, summits, all of that. Always having that online, and this is our plan as we move forward, as the world becomes more physical and COVID that changes, and people are able to be more face-to-face, we will absolutely keep our commitment to those virtual, online, that access, much like what y'all are doing. And accessibility really is the key. There are folks that have said that the world opened up for them. People with disabilities often have expressed that when the world kind of closed down for others because of the access. And we'll move to the next slide. So here are just some tips when it comes to organizing online events and meetings, and we'll move to the next. And by the way, I just want to say y'all are doing such a great job, because you recognize this right off the bat, that disability is often a consequence of the environment. More than a lot of organizations that I've worked with, y'all are very in touch with what that really means, whether it's Mark understanding the importance of those alt text tags, and whether it's just understanding how to navigate physical environment and virtual environments. But that is often when I realize about my own learning disabilities, is when I am up against a barrier. And so knocking those barriers down virtually and physically, for those of us who have print-related disabilities, is huge. And there are easy ways to do that, and we're going to talk about that. So we'll move to the next slide. Some of the keys here, though, is awareness, knowing who's showing up, knowing who could show up, knowing what they might need. It may be just as simple as what we did as we were starting out, just describing who we, you know, what we look like, so you can orient to who's speaking on screen. We believe that awareness leads to preparedness. That's really what it's all about. And, having that detailed production script is one of the things that we've started doing with times and reminders, knowing when we're going to pass something to the next speaker, much like Natalie has done. That's great modeling here. And so I'll show you some examples of some that we have created. This also promotes inclusion, because then you can have speakers with disabilities. Somebody that might have a lot of anxiety and not know what to expect, but has a lot of wealth and wisdom to share. Somebody who might perhaps, like me, have neurodiversity and need that structure. So it just makes it a more inclusive meeting and helps people in event and helps people know what to expect. It's especially helpful, to get everybody on the same page. The documents that I'm about to show, and we can move to the next, are from a neurodiversity event that just happened last week. And I know these are small, and I'm happy to share them, but this happened in Virginia, Virginia Tech. And the main thing is just showing you that we had like a cliff notes of when the meeting begins, what are the time schedule. I actually have that here for this meeting. Once again, this is where y'all continue to lead the way, but it's good for everybody to know this is a best practice. And then also having what to do at the very beginning of the meeting, what are we going to do in the middle, what are we going to do as we wrap up, and then a very detailed script of who's going, what's the order that presenters are going to be going, what are some possible questions that might need to be asked, and having time with each of those. It's incredibly helpful, very respectful, and it keeps everything on track. So accessibility, inclusion, universal design for learning, all wrapped up into the way that you can organize and make meetings successful. We'll move to the next slide. Absolutely. Whether we're doing a virtual or in-person meeting, it is very helpful to have folks identify who's going to participate, whether they'll need accommodations and materials. So doing that legwork ahead of time makes a big difference, and it really can make your meeting much more inclusive. And we can move to the next slide. We're finding, by the way, so much so that folks are showing up with all kinds of disabilities, if you will. We have started having people who are deaf-blind showing up to our meetings because they know they're accessible and because we have thought of them before they showed up. We've had all kinds of folks with different disabilities from around the world showing up to our trainings because of that. And what we find is that no one size fits all. It's not a no one size fits all solution. You've got to think about multiple different disabilities, multiple ways of being inclusive. Having a moderator or a host, and we have those right now, is a best practice, no doubt, so that everything can stay on track. And somebody's monitoring the chat, and then also just keeping everything else moving smoothly forward, which is very, very important. And we'll move to the next slide. So a couple of tips. Evaluate the platform ahead of time. There are changes. The Ability Summit is going on right now with Microsoft, and they are launching new initiatives all the time. So if you use Teams, stay up to date. The features are changing. Make sure that it's compatible, and also understand that people are coming from different platforms, not just Microsoft Teams, but also Microsoft Teams on Mac, right? So that could offer a whole other hurdle, if you will. Plan ahead, as I said, but allowing that 2+ weeks for captioning, sign language interpreters. We go ahead and schedule those now for all of our events. We don't wait for the request. It's just, once again, best practice. Knowing your audience and being prepared for them when they show up, and know that it means a lot that you thought of them before they even signed up, which is great. Use that accessibility checker. I'm not going to get into Mark's space at all, but he's right on about this and all the things that he's going to be sharing with you. and have those presenter materials ahead of time. I usually try to get those at least 3 days ahead of time, and I share them with the interpreters, I share them with captionists, and sometimes we share them with folks who have requested them ahead of time that might be blind or have low vision or use a screen reader. Also, be very mindful of acronyms and jargon. A lot of times people say plain language. I say that's great, but let's make it as simple as possible too. And we move to the next. So another thing when we're thinking about the invitations, some people will create this awesome accessible meeting and the invitations are not accessible. So don't do that. Don't make that mistake. Make sure that you are thinking accessibility from the moment you invite someone all the way through to the survey at the very end. And just thinking about all of those things of labeling fields, contrast, all of that. And we'll move to the next. So, on the day of the setup, I always allow at least 30 minutes. Otherwise, it can become pretty darn stressful. And having your captionists and sign language interpreters there early. Once again, this meeting right here, y'all model that. One of the best examples of how to do this right. Making sure that everybody feels comfortable, everybody's ready to create that very positive learning environment. That also helps so that everyone is on the same page, and then we can focus on the content, not all the drama and technical issues behind the scenes. So preparing that message also can be very helpful with the list of links ahead of time. That's something you can do weeks in advance because now we're kind of in this moment where you have that stuff available. I have a whole list of things that I'm going to put into the chat when I'm moderating, and I have that prepared weeks in advance where I can just put in the links, put in the resources, all of that, setting up that accessible survey, having it all ready, and we move to the next. So once again, creating for the attendees. So you want to think about this. Designing with universal design for learning principles and inclusive design principles from the get-go. Having multiple ways that a person can ask a question or interact. Microsoft is working on some more of these when it comes to polling and more collaborative approaches to these types of trainings and meetings. So stay tuned. And then also providing multiple modes of engagement, extremely important. The meeting that I was just referring to at Virginia Tech, there was a woman on who was both deaf and blind. And so she needed to ask her question a whole different way. And thankfully we were ready. There are sometimes that folks need to have the interpreter voice for them. Y'all are very familiar with that. A lot of other folks are not. So just being ready and incorporating those universal design for learning principles. And we'll move to the next slide. So tips for after the meeting. Those transcripts are now, it's custom. It's best practice, definitely. But it's one of those things that a lot of folks expect to be able to download so that they can, if they're using a Braille display, they can actually go through the whole training and have their refreshable Braille display. Read that. That's also why we want to say our names whenever we're speaking, whether it's as an attendee or a moderator or a presenter, every time we speak, because that's the way it ends up in the transcript. And then we also have to consider privacy, because sometimes people do put things into the chat or into their Q&A that could be private, and so just being mindful of that. Also thinking about all the visuals and making sure that all the visuals were described. If they were not described in the presentation, then we need to incorporate audio description in the post-production. So being mindful of that. Also cleaning up any of that captioning that might need to be there, and ensuring once again that the website that we put these up on and the player that's used, all of those things are accessible. So accessibility from the invitation to the post-production, and we'll move to the next. So a couple of more best practices and resources. The web content accessibility guidelines, WCAG, they're about to come out with 3.0. A lot of us have been weighing in on that, so stay tuned. But know that those are out there, and they have great information when it comes to cognitive load and a lot of other disabilities that they had not really addressed before. Absolutely do those as surveys and include accessibility in that survey as far as a question, and listen and learn to that feedback. We continue to evaluate and evolve, and that's great. And once again, y'all lead the way when it comes to this, which is great. And we'll move to the next slide. So just a few things when it comes to presenting online, and then I'll talk about speaking and then moderating, and then I'll turn it right back over. So if we will move to the next slide. So plan, make, share, plan for inclusion, and make those presentations accessible, just like you're going to hear from Mark, and then share, as I said, as much as you can ahead of time to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And we'll move to the next. The rate of speech is one of those things that we have been trying to work with our presenters on. So just another presenter tip, slow down. Slowing down is good. The average person speaks between 125 to 150 words a minute. There are times that, believe it or not, being here like from the South and Georgia and the US, we are supposedly slow talkers, but I can talk upwards of 200 words a minute, which is not so great. So slow down. And there are icons on this slide for all of those things. It's almost always better to speak slowly than too quickly. As I said, use that plain language, and silence really is okay. You know, it's one of those things that I think people get very nervous if there's silence in a virtual meeting, but silence is okay. And we'll move to the next slide. A couple of other things, when you're, as I said, when you're have surveys, polls, all of that, describe them so that anything that is visually important, make sure that you actually do describe. Face the camera. There are some of you, I bet, right now that are reading my lips as I'm moving my lips, and so make sure you're facing the camera. A lot of people are still facing off one way or the other. And also don't assume that everyone can see your slides, hear you, understand, read the chat. I still cannot read the chat very well, even with my own assistive technology, and I'm working with Microsoft on that. And we'll move to the next. And just a couple of more things. When you're giving links, speak out the URL because it'll be captured in the transcript, and also people can hear it. That's also why I try to use simple URLs, you know, web pages. Also, you know, once again, multiple means of expression. So copy that URL, put it in the chat so somebody can click and go straight to it. The QR codes are also super helpful, and having those on slides. And we'll move to the next slide. Also thinking about ways that people can interact. There's, as I said, the features are always changing. Microsoft now has included the raise your hand feature. You know, that is a great feature. It's easy for a lot of folks to find that because screen readers can find that. So use those types of features. And also have participants, you know, ready for asking questions, all of that, and be flexible once again in how you take those questions. And we'll move to the next slide. So speaking online, just a couple of things here, and we'll move. So a couple of things. Whenever you are speaking as an attendee or just speaking, it is good the very first time to, just like you heard Natalie and Kira and I introduce ourselves with that short description name, but then also physical description. It's very, very helpful because it allows people to orient. Make sure that you're muting. A lot of times people are still forgetting to do that, so we can limit the background noise, and only one person speaking at a time. We're getting better at this, I think, as a culture, but it still can be an issue. Also, say your name each time so that your name appears in the transcript and it's easier to track who said what. And we'll move to the next. And you may want to change your pronouns. That's now very common around in different communities. So making sure that folks are being addressed with the proper pronouns that they would like. And then also Making sure if you share your screen or show the visuals, not being too descriptive, but, an example would be, if I had that example up here of, this is a photograph of the cover of the UN 2020 report, and the cover depicts blah, blah, blah. And we'll move to the next. So a couple other things. I just put an image here so you could see that raise your hand feature. And there are a lot of other things. Just stay up to date when it comes to ways that you can acknowledge and get into the conversation in these meetings. And we'll move to the next. All right, moderating. Just a couple of slides here. Let's go. Once again, say your name as a moderator. It's very important. I think the moderator is much more important now than even in physical environments. So making sure that everything is going smoothly, everything is running behind the scenes, no problem. Making sure also there are guides for moderating, and having that as part of your practices and your own guidelines. And we'll move to the next slide. And when it comes to that interaction, making sure that actually the moderator has that ability to interact and keep things moving, allowing and understanding that not everybody's able to see that chat. As I said, there are times that I, as a participant, and I'm interacting with the moderator all the time. Sometimes I'm even having to email the moderator because I can't engage in chat. So thinking about some of those things too. So multiple ways to get in touch with that moderator. Thank you so much for your time. I hope this was helpful. And I, once again, just know that I'm here to help and build back better. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Yeah, thanks.
Really great advice there. And we know that that was a lot of information and detail. So we will have those slides to you right after this presentation. Thanks a lot for sharing this invaluable information. Back to Kira now to talk about sign language. Over to you, Kira.
Thanks so much, Natalie, and really great presentation, Carolyn. Excellent tips. This is Kira Kruglikova. Again, I am the light-skinned lady with the red scarf. We're going to be talking, just showing a little video about sign language, about how to get the best from a sign language interpretation. Just a quick reaction to what Carolyn has said. So many of these tips are good advice for everyone in a meeting. This is the idea of universal design. Universal design makes it better for everyone, regardless of what they have, if they have a disability or not. Great lighting, great sound, huge difference. It can require an investment in equipment, but it'll really pay off in the effectiveness of your intervention. So we'll be showing in a video in a second. I just wanted to mention that the United Nations office at Geneva provides accessibility services during meetings. There's 3 types of accessibility services. We do interpretation in international sign language. There is real-time captioning. Generally, that's available in several languages depending on the needs of the meeting. There's also embossing in Braille. That's done only upon request when people need it. These services are available for mandated meetings. So the main one that you may have heard of is the Committee on Persons with the Rights of Disability. When that convention came into force and that body was located in Geneva, we in the Division of Conference Management spent a lot of time working with the committee, working with our colleagues at the Substantive Secretariat in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, figuring out what is the best way to provide them the services they need. The great thing about that is we now have a really good team of people. We know how to run these kinds of services and provide them. So if somebody wants to have a sign language interpretation or captioning, and it's not a mandated meeting, we can provide those services on a cost recovery basis. So we can give you a price, etc. If you're interested in those sorts of services or also just want to know more about how to make them work, please contact, this is mms@un.org. MMS stands for Meetings Management Section. So I think let's go ahead and show the video now, please.
Hello and welcome to this video about sign language interpretation for virtual meetings. Over the next few minutes, sign language interpreter Oliver Pulvio will introduce you to various tips on how to organize and ensure effective sign language interpretation for your meeting.
Today, I'm going to be going through a few best practices or guidelines to help you integrate sign language interpretation into your virtual meeting. When thinking about organizing sign language interpreters for your meeting, there are a number of aspects to consider. Number one, who is your audience? Do you have deaf people who have requested sign language who have already registered? If so, what sign language would be the best fit for them? If you have several deaf people from different countries who have registered, international sign is probably going to be your best bet. Or if you simply want to provide an accessible meeting which is open to the widest number of deaf people possible, then international sign would also be a good choice. Normally, we have 2 or 3 sign language interpreters to a team, and we change about every 15 or 20 minutes. In order for us to do the best job possible for your meeting, we need 4 essential things. We need really good sound and visual quality to be able to do our job. Before the meeting, we will log on with you maybe an hour, maybe in half an hour before, to make sure that our visual and audio quality is good for the meeting and that we are well connected and ready to go. We also need to have a clear channel with somebody on your team who's responsible for the technical side of things in case there's a problem on our end or if there's a problem on your end. And last, we need, as much as possible, the documentation relating to the meeting. Anything regarding the meeting, regarding the speaker's notes or the PowerPoints, we really appreciate having those many days in advance. Ideally, when working in platforms, you have a speaker view or a gallery view. Gallery view is going to work best when you have sign language interpretation. Now, when you have a presenter who is sharing their screen, sharing their presentation, you want that to take up most of the screen. Now, you don't have much screen space left for everyone else, mainly the sign language interpreter and the speaker, but it's okay to have those 2 videos on and no one else's video on when someone is sharing a screen. When the presenter is not sharing a screen, then you have a little bit more space to work with. So it works very well to keep 2 videos on the screen side by side, or even 4 videos on the screen. And those 4 videos might be your moderator, your presenter, the interpreter, and somebody asking a question. Now, if you want to have more of a group discussion, you can even up the amount of video windows when the screen is not being shared to 6. So you'd have the sign language interpreter and then 5 participants having a discussion. I would highly recommend not going more than 6. A sign language interpreter in a small window is very, very hard to see, and it thus becomes ineffective. One question that we get often is, why can't we use these great features like pinning the speaker or spotlighting the interpreter? The answer is, you are definitely free to use those features, but in the recommendations, not using those features is actually much easier because it's less of a burden on you and your technical staff, and it's less of a burden on us as interpreters. This way, we are in charge of when we change interpreters, and we can do that completely from our side without letting you know that it's time to change who's spotlighted. One thing that's very important to convey to the speakers of your meeting or whoever you've invited to be on your panel is that when they are not actively participating in the meeting, it's important for them to turn their video and audio off. This is so we can save space on the screen and to make sure that people are concentrating on what is actively being presented during the meeting. You also want to make sure that the speakers of the meeting are speaking at a moderate pace and that people aren't taking turns too quickly or they aren't flipping through their slides too quickly. When you have interpretation, your interpreters are going to be slightly behind you. That is just the nature of the work. And if you go through your slides too quickly, by the time the sign language interpreter is pointing at your slides, they'll be pointing at the wrong thing. So take a breath, take a drink of water, and then click next slide. But in general, the advice that I have given before in terms of gallery view and non-video participants hidden, those are the two most important parts to making sure that you have a successful meeting with sign language interpretation.
Great. Thank you very much to Kira for introducing the video and to our colleagues for sharing that. This is Natalie, your moderator, back, and I'm passing now on to Mark Murphy for the next, speaking about multimedia. Thanks, Mark. I do believe you're on mute, Mark. Just double check.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks for the prompt. So my name is Mark Murphy. I am a white male, short grey hair, and I'm wearing a black top. My background is white with some text and also has the logo of the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy. So I'm going to talk today about creating accessible digital content for online publications, something that we've discovered is essential. So I'm going to have a quick overview, then we're going to look at some alt text descriptions and how they're super important for our online publications, and then how to make multimedia content accessible. So we go to the next slide. So our experience, as for any publication, is to plan, plan, plan. In our daily work, there are many stages in the production process, and each one has to be planned with the final output in mind. Roles, responsibilities need to be defined, and accessibility has to be factored in from the very beginning. We've learned from experience that it's very complicated and time consuming to try and retrofit a publication to be accessible. So we always try to have our publications born accessible, that's to say conceived with accessibility in mind. We heard from Carolyn how important it is to identify your audience and what they require in order for them to fully participate in an event, or in our case, how to fully access a publication. We've produced accessible publications for the visually impaired, such as the UNOG Annual Report and the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. These publications are designed to use assistive technology, such as screen readers, to make them accessible. In these publications, we've also added multimedia products, which also need to be made accessible to enhance the digital experience for all users. So it's important at the planning stage to decide on what type of multimedia content your project will have and the level of accessibility required. This can be based on a number of things: your publishing program, your mandate, your audience, also your resources. The online publications we produce for our clients contain images and multimedia which has to be adapted to be made accessible. This is done using alt text for the description of images in our accessible PDFs, and ensuring videos are made accessible. We use the best production processes possible and values, and contain captions, subtitles, audio descriptions, or sign language where appropriate, as you've seen in the previous video, which was actually made by the design and production section. And of course, our designers have to take on the challenge of adhering to the universal design principles that you can see there, so that the design is accessible for as many people as possible. If we go to the next slide, a little bit of detail about alternative text descriptions, or alt text. So alternative text, alt text, is a written description of an image. Alt text can be read out loud by a screen reader with disabilities, or for users who just prefer audio. The alt text description is included in the metadata of the image and is not visible in the PDF. In all publications, all visual assets, photos, maps, infographics, require captions, and for accessible publications, these assets also require alternative text descriptions. So in our experience, these alt text descriptions need to be written by someone, and we find that the best placed people to write these captions are the subject matter experts. That has to be factored in when the publication is being written. Then they're incorporated into the layout during the technical production stage by us. And again, graphic designers need to take on board all the universal design principles when creating layouts, making sure that they're accessible. So just to summarize, just as a best practice for writing the alt text descriptions, summarize what you see in one or informative sentence, keep your description neutral and informative, use proper grammar, spelling and punctuation, and like we've heard earlier, to make things accessible, avoid acronyms and symbols. If we just pop to the next slide, an example of an alt text. The picture shows a stack of pancakes, blueberry pancakes, scattered with powdered sugar. And the first attempt at writing an alt text there was just to use the word pancakes. Clearly they are pancakes, but it's not very descriptive and doesn't really bring the visually impaired reader into the conversation, in giving them full access to the image. So as you can see, the second description is far better. It's more descriptive. It's not just a stack of pancakes anymore. It would actually give a better image of what's there. If we just go to the next slide as well. Just another example. The picture is an illuminated sign for takeaway of fish and chips, but the description just says sign. And if you can't see the image, what does that sign mean? Sign here for is it an instruction? We don't know. So someone who's written the second one has just put too much information there. And if we look at the last one, the best practice there is to say fish and chips takeaway, comma, sign, which tells you what the sign says and tells you that it is a sign. So just when coding these things, it's important that not just they have the text, that they also have some sort of navigation tools, so that when the images appear in the publication, the visually impaired reader can navigate through the publication. Very important. The screen reader software has to be able to read the alt text description, but also to recognize them. And that's where there's some coding that comes into the metadata that tells the assistive technology where to go and helps the reader to skip from page to page, or the visually impaired person to avoid long descriptions of tables of contents and things like this. So we go to the next slide. Many of the publications that we produce that go online can have multimedia content, so multimedia can be defined as a form of communication that combines text, audio, images, animations into a single presentation. So for our digital publications, what in a print publication would be a photograph with some quoted text can become a video. Photos can be slideshows, infographics can be animated, and URLs are clickable. All this multimedia has to be created, but it also has to be made accessible. Much the same way as with the alt text, the inclusion of multimedia has to be planned at the beginning and factored into the workflow, because trying to add retrofit, for example, captions or sign language is very complicated, time consuming. So again, this born accessible, we have to think at the very beginning of our product, what is the target audience and how are they going to view it? So we've seen that the majority of our multimedia output is video. So making these accessible begins with the quality of the film. I think that was mentioned earlier. Good accessibility is good for everyone. So we also have to consider the platform that they're going to be viewed on. Again, some animated infographics that are viewed on a phone are not really accessible to anybody, just things that we've learned. So as I said, general rule, good accessibility is good for everyone. So videos that have good lighting, where speech is clear and concise, is already easier to access for the visually or hearing impaired communities. So just some pointers there. In order to make video accessible, we need to consider a number of devices such as captions, text versions of the audio content, audio descriptions, a separate narrative audio track that describes important visual content. A transcript is great because it can help people read through at a later date, and it also helps to navigate through a video. And as I think we've heard before, sign language is the preferred language of many deaf people. So sign language in multimedia videos can be used when appropriate. And I think, again, this was mentioned before, we need to remember that content presented visually has to be described in order for it to be accessible to visually impaired people. I think, yeah, we saw a number of those in the video that we saw. So just like a publication that has a table of contents and you can flick through it, navigating through multimedia content like videos and slideshows is important to the user experience for all users. And we found that videos that we link to from publications onto YouTube can include a table of contents, which helps people navigate, but for make them accessible, all those navigation instructions need to be described in audio and need to be implemented accessibly through using a keyboard prompt. So they're just some of our experiences in producing online publications. We use the alt text and the multimedia accessible. Thank you. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Mark. I guess that really highlights the importance of pre-planning to include these accessibility elements. Thank you very much. Our final speaker today is Juan Carlos, speaking about documentation. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalie. My name is Juan Carlos Corol. I have short brown hair and I'm wearing a light blue shirt and blue jacket. And my background is white with the logo of the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy. Thank you. What accessibility problems we can find in Word documents? I'm going to do a brief introduction to what we can consider as the most common accessibility problems in Word documents and what we can do to avoid them. I'm going to talk about three main aspects: the accessibility checker and design choices, images, and tables. Let's move to the next slide, please. Thank you. The accessibility checker. The main tool we find in Word related to accessibility is under the Review tab. The button Accessibility Checker will help us to identify any issue related to accessibility. Clicking on this button, a panel appears on the right side of the screen showing all the problems to be fixed. Main issues are, in most cases, the missing alternative text in figures and tables. Why do we need an alternative text? We need it because the screen reader doesn't read or recognize images. The screen reader will just read the alternative text. And now I would like to give you some tips that would help us to produce more accessible Word documents. First of all, choose, if it's possible, a font that at least be 12 points and sans serif, like Calibri, Helvetica, Geneva, or Verdana. We should avoid the use of a large amount of bold, capitalized, or italic text. Acronyms, symbols, and abbreviations should be explained at the top of the page rather than in the footnotes or at the end of the document. We should also avoid creating white space using Tab, Enter, or Spacebar. It should be created using the layout tools like Page Break or Section Break. Now, I will talk about an important point: styles and headings. The styles and headings provided in the software are necessary for screen readers to correctly interpret the information. Headings should follow a logical structure. It means heading 1 and then heading 2, etc. Following this way, we should be able to add automatic table of contents. Microsoft Styles are by default creating a navigation panel on the left side. Based on that styles, also useful for non-disabled persons to understand the structure of the document. We can activate it under View tab, Navigation panel. Another important issue is the language. Please be sure that the language of the text is the language selected in Word. If that is not the case, the screen reader will read with the pronunciation from another language, making it unintelligible. I will show you an example of this problem in a table in a few minutes. To be sure what language is selected, you can easily check at the bottom left of the screen. To modify it, select the text. Click on the language at the bottom left and select the correct one, or go to the Review tab and then Language. And finally, the hyperlinks. It is really important for screen readers that they are activated. They should be in blue underlined and changing into purple underlined when read once. When they are activated, the person will be able to choose between visit the website or avoid it and continue. Let's move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now I will talk about images. Keep in mind that the rule here is all images should have an alternative text and not be used for layout purposes. If they bring additional information to the text but don't have alternative text or rely on color code like a graphic without text, the options to fix it are to add an alternative text with a right click on the image and edit the alternative text. We always recommend to use no more than 125 characters, like a tweet. And for color and contrast issues, we can add patterns like grid or dots or different shapes like bullets, square, arrows, etc. In any case, the accessibility checker will probably show us that issue. Blocks, encadrés en français, are problematic because they are composed of text boxes that the screen reader doesn't read. It's the same for images with text, like in the bottom left of that slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now I will talk about the tables. Tables can be read by screen readers if they are well formatted, but by essence, tables are not easy to be interpreted for visually impaired persons. Even when a table is technically accessible, understanding it by impaired person requires a lot of effort to apprehend the information. So we could say that the rule is tables should not be used for layout purposes, and they should have an alternative text describing the structure, the numbers, rows, columns, and titles of headers. It's important to check the reading order of cells. Put your mouse over the first cells and press Read Aloud button to verify in which order cells will be read. A problematic example could be a document translated from Arabic, maybe, that keep the original settings, so it will be from the right to the left. And finally, two problematic kind of cells: merged cells and blank cells. Merged cells are the most problematic, as it's more difficult to make sense and a greater risk of wrong order. Blank cells are misleading screen readers, as it seems the end of the table, so we should avoid using the use of them, and we could maybe use 2 or 3 points, dots, or dash. On this slide, we have two tables. The first one with some accessibility issues like the font, the type and the size, the contrast, and the text layout. But even more, I decided to keep the Spanish as the language. So let's play the first video, please.
Notification of hazardous activities. Number. Hazardous activity. Full name and address. Location of the hazardous. Of the operator of the production facilities. Hazardous activity. And distance from the border of the country.
Interesting, isn't it? Now let's play the second one, please.
Notification of hazardous activities. Number. Hazardous activity. Full name and address of the operator of the hazardous activity. Location of the hazardous production facilities and distance from the border of the country.
I think it's better. The conclusion. I think that paying attention to some tips and using Word tools properly will help us to produce more accessible Word documents. Thank you very much. Back to you, Natalie.
Thanks very much, Juan Carlos, for this information. Fantastic. So thanks to all of our speakers. We do realize we're at 5 p.m. and some of you may need to leave. So if you do, we very much understand. Thank you for joining us. We're going to stick around for 5 minutes more and answer some of your questions. And a lot of them have been answered by our moderators behind the scenes as well in writing. So we'll make sure to have the Q&A transcript to you in an email after the event. But let's answer a few live just to be sure. So Susie has asked a question here. What is the difference between live captions and closed captions? Could you clarify what that means, especially I think in the UN environment? So over to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. So I'm Rebecca Edgington. I'm International Sign Focal Point at UNOG. And I have shoulder-length brown hair and light-skinned, and I have a white background. Just to answer on the closed captions versus live captions, closed captions catch everything that happens. So if a door slams, if the birds are tweeting in the background, they will capture all of that. So that is about the closed captions. Whilst I'm on, if I could just answer the questions on sign language that I'm seeing, and if there's an advantage to have sign language as well as the captioning or subtitling of a video. The answer is yes, because interpretation is more than just words. It conveys much more meaning, it gives the emotion, and it therefore encourages greater participation and fuller accessibility and involvement of your deaf participants in your meeting.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. If you wouldn't mind also sticking online though, because there is a question also, a few questions about accessibility for deaf participants. Are captions sufficient for them? Would you have any advice on that? Back to you, Rebecca.
There have been many studies, so it's Rebecca again, and there have been many studies on this. And unfortunately, due to barriers in education, many deaf people around the world do have lower reading ages than might be expected given their level of intelligence and of their expert input that they would have for a meeting. We all know how difficult it is to follow captions going across the bottom of the screen whilst you're trying to focus on the speakers and on the presentations as well. Sign languages are the native languages, so the mother tongues of many deaf people around the world. Therefore, sign language is definite added value and it's more direct and would be the preferred way to be inclusive to deaf participants. Having said that, captioning is also very important and it does reach a wider audience as well. And captioning is very important for many other people, including non-native speakers who might be using the captions too.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I see that most other questions have been answered in the chat, but there is one that I would like to pass to Kira just briefly, which is about how do we get in touch with the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy team, especially those coming from agencies. Would you like to expand just for a moment there, Kira? Thank you.
Great. No, thanks very much, Natalie. This is Kira again, the red scarf lady, hopefully not the red flag lady. We do have an email, and I have to admit I'm looking for our email. What we can do is put the email in the chat. I'd have to go back. I think it's UNOG Disability Inclusion. I think it's UNOG Disability Inclusion at UN.org. So if people are interested, go ahead and just send an email to that email address, and then we'll get back to you. We have the secretary of the team, Marin Koppel, is also on this call, and she has a very wide network of colleagues across the common system who deal with accessibility issues. There's also, we put in the email address in response to the question about country teams and headquarters, which is the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy email. There's an entity within the Executive Office of the Secretary General who manages the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, and they reach out to all parts of the Secretariat, and then they also have other connections elsewhere. So that, if you're interested in the overall disability inclusion strategy, I would get in touch with them. And then if you're interested in us, what we're doing here in UNOG, use that other email, the UNOG Disability Inclusion Strategy at UN.org. So, and we welcome participation. And of course, what's incredible is things move so fast. There was a long question about someone had indicated their early experience with Teams wasn't very positive and it wasn't meeting their needs, and they found Zoom more effective. Zoom is being adopted more and more. But currently, because of some of the potential security issues, and I think everybody may remember at the start of the pandemic, there was a thing called Zoom bombing, where people who weren't supposed to be in a meeting would show up and then they would disrupt the meeting. So the Office of Information and Communications Technology in New York is working on evaluating Zoom. There's also a new tender, a procurement action going on to see about getting new platforms to use for remote simultaneous interpretation. Right now, there are 3 being used by the UN: Interpify, Interactio, and Kudo. And those are designed much more to work with full-on conference interpreters and such. But I will say that my understanding, especially from the colleagues who've worked with sign language interpretation, is that at this point it is quite complicated. It's bringing in lots of different streams and pulling things together. So I wouldn't say that it's all seamless yet at this point, but I will not be surprised that within a year that all is sorted out. I was in a presentation for Microsoft, which is under non-disclosure agreement, but they have some amazing things that they will be rolling out. And of course, that's Microsoft. There's many other platforms that are continuing to evolve at the same time. So we may think of this may turn out to be sort of an interim period before almost what might, I hope, become a golden age of online accessibility. I hope that was helpful. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Kira. Great. So we did have quite a few questions come in, so we're going to make sure to share the Q&A transcript with you following the session. I'm afraid we're a little bit out of time, but thanks for joining us and for contributing so many good questions and feedback. Thanks a lot to all of our speakers. We're going to put on the screen now some resources that they've shared with us, as well as the iSeek toolkit that Kira mentioned, as well as many other really great resources that you can use post-event today. So if we go over to the next slide, finding where to find all of this information, there is a URL over on the next slide called our resource guide for this session. And we are also going to put this in the chat and also email it to you. So this is where you're going to find the resources from our speakers, also the iSeek toolkit for inclusion of persons with disabilities, which is regularly updated by the inclusion team, as well as the library research guide on disability inclusion. So don't worry, we'll have this for you to be able to keep learning. You can connect with us and join us for more Commons events over on the next slide. You can also subscribe to know what's happening each month at the Commons. We'd love to see you again. But this is all for now, so thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to all of our speakers, Carolyn, Kira, Mark, Juan Carlos, and Rebecca, and the Disability Inclusion team behind the scenes working on this. Our producers today are Leia, Isabella, and Yvette. It takes a village, so thank you very much for producing today's session. We will be able to see a video very soon showing the library doors closing, but we would love your feedback. So email us at commons@un.org. We'll put this in the chat. If you have feedback, we also have a QR code that will end this session. So thank you very much for joining us. We really hope to have you back with us at the Commons soon, but for now, bye.